Today I want to show you how to do the traveling vine infinity cable. This right here is one repeat that has been worked up, and this is a swatch I've got already started, but I want to work this through with you one time so that you can see each step along the way. I have already completed row 1 and row 2, which are simple single crochet rows of 16 stitches. On all of these rows, I like to refer to this is the background stitches, these single crochets, and then the floating stitches, the way that we do them and push them towards the front, they sit kind of on top of those background stitches. So our background stitches will always be 16 stitches for the traveling vine cable example. On row 3, we are going to single crochet in the first, and now we've already come to where we need to start our front floating stitches. For this cable pattern, we will be working 3 floating stitches together. To do this, on the very first time we work our floating stitches, we will work into a stitch that is 2 rows below. And when I say a stitch, a lot of times I like just to work through 1 loop of yarn 2 rows below. So we're doing 3 front float stitches into 1 loop of yarn 2 rows below. So instead of going all the way around like this, which would be considered a post stitch, I like to not tug at my fabric so much and only work through 1 loop of yarn 2 rows below. So I will go ahead and work through that loop, and I will complete 1 floating double crochet, and then I'm going to work into that same loop and do another floating double crochet, and then I'm going to do it again for a 3rd time into that same loop 2 rows below, and there's my 3rd floating double crochet. Now it kind of feels fickly here, they're kind of just hanging out, but they will make sense as we continue and move on. Now that we've done 3 floating stitches, 3 floating double crochets, we want to continue to single crochet our background stitches, and we need to single crochet 4 of those. But when we go to work those, we do not want to skip anything on the back. So don't skip anything, go directly into the very next single crochet stitch on that background fabric. What this does is it helps pop those floating stitches onto the front, and it eliminates any gaps or holes on the back. So we will single crochet 4, and now we are to our first opening curve. This opening curve will count as 6 floating stitches and 2 single crochet stitches, and here's how it is worked. We will pick a strand from 1 row below, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick this strand right here, one of the V strands, and I'm going to yarn over. I'm going to go into that strand, kind of one I picked between the 2 stitches, the next 2 single crochet stitches, and I'm going to go ahead and complete a floating double crochet. Now notice, because of the way we're placing this, it kind of leans to the right. That's what we want, because this is an opening curve like a circle. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the 2 remaining floating stitches, because we're doing 3 floating stitches together, but this time I am going to work above that previous one. So I'm working into that same loop, but I'm pushing my stitches to where my next one is worked to the left of, kind of above the previous floating stitch. And now I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to put my hook into the strand above the other 2 stitches. So I'm kind of working my stitches from bottom up around that strand from below. So now I have my 3 floating stitches hanging out, and once again we will single crochet 2. Make sure that you're not skipping any stitches on the back. And now to complete our opening curve, we want to connect, this is how we make a curve, connect to those floating stitches we previously did. I find that if I turn my work a little bit, it helps me out. And now I'm going to work from top down into those previous floating stitches. So I don't always like to go all the way around like a post stitch. For floating stitches, I only like to work through 1 to 2 strands of that stitch. I find that they join a little bit more seamlessly. So there's my first floating stitch, and we have 2 more to go, working from top down from those previous stitches. And there's my second floating stitch, and now here goes my third floating stitch. So as you can see there, we have 6 floating stitches. Right now it might look a bit bulky. The next row will really bring it together because we're not really seeing much of that infinity cable just yet. We just have our opening curve here. Now without skipping any stitches on the back, I am going to single crochet in the next 4. And now I will front float 3 double crochets to 2 rows below, and I'm going to bring that back to a stitch over here. The reason being is because as we look at this cable as it continues on, this part, if we were to like connect it to the one previous, is angled. So as you can see right here, it's angled this way and this one. So if we wanted to continue to connect those, if we were to seam it together, we want this angle to come back. So we're going to front float 3 treble stitches. Just like so. And now I will single crochet 4 on my background stitches without skipping any stitches. And now for our last grouping of front floating stitches in this row, we will front float 3 double crochet from a strand below from row 1. And unless I'm doing an opening curve, I tend to work these from top down on that loop. But it really is personal preference on those. It's not a hard and fast rule on those. It won't really matter. And now I've single crocheted in my last stitch. So right now this is really curving this way. That's because we've got a lot of these stitches that are kind of pulling that fabric out. This next row on all wrong side rows, and this will be the only time that I'll really show this in the video because they're all the same. On the wrong side rows, all we will do every single time is single crochet 16, skipping, so I'll skip the next 3 floating stitches, skipping all floating stitches. And what this does is it brings that fabric back to the background stitch size, so it maintains that width gauge, and it also pushes those floating stitches to the front. Now the trickiest part of doing this sometimes is finding those center stitches when you do this opening curve. So sometimes I'll count 1, 2, 3, then I know I had 2 between on that opening curve, and then I'll skip the next 3 and keep on going. And I'll skip these 3 floating stitches and single crochet in the last. And now as we turn our work back to the right side, you can see how much those now pop, and we can kind of see what we're working with here, even though it might look a little bit funny. So on to row 5. I will single crochet in my first, and now we'll be working around the stitches, the floating stitches that we did previously. So I will front float double crochet 3, and I'm going to front float double crochet around the previous floating stitches. I'm going to work through those. And once again, if you'll see, I don't tend to go around the entire stitch. I tend to just grab a couple of strands from that stitch. I just like the way it looks versus doing an entire post stitch that kind of pulls that fabric a little bit more. If I just grab a couple strands, it kind of allows those stitches to connect together a little bit more seamlessly. Now I'm going to single crochet 3, and front float 3 double crochet, and this will be around the next 3 available. So this is part of that opening curve, but now it's going to travel. So you find those 3 stitches. Oh, tough time getting around that last one. Kind of tucked away in there. But now we can kind of see how it takes shape. Then I'm going to single crochet 4. And now I have front float 3 double crochet again. So the next available are the other side of that curve. Now we can see that opening curve a bit better. And I also find that as we continue to do rows and we crochet around the previous post stitches, it really starts to help those cables take shape and shape a lot better. Now I'm going to single crochet 4. And front float double crochet around these previous post stitches. Looking good. And now we are going to single crochet 3. Front float 3 double crochet. And single crochet in our last. And then as we do the reverse row, it'll really help those cables pop by single crocheting in all the background stitches only. When we come back, I'm going to actually come back to row 11 because the row 7 and 9 are just a continuation of what we're doing. You're just moving those cables along, but you're just working the same style across where you're single crocheting the back stitches, front floating 3 double crochet around the available floating stitches, and working across. Here we are back at row 11. I want to show you this row because we are doing our very first crossover, and I want to walk through that with you. So at row 11, we will single crochet in our first single crochet stitch, and then we will do a group of front float 3 double crochet along the edgings. And if you find that your cables are looking a bit sloppy or loose, feel free to do a half double crochet instead. Essentially eliminate one of the yarn overs if this is too loose, but then you also don't want it so tight that it's pulling that background fabric. You want it to be able to sit nicely on top of that background fabric. Then our next step will be to single crochet 4. And now we are going to do our front floating cross. So this will be a left cross, which means that it will appear to cross on the left. So we will first create the right cross. So we're going to skip these 3 front floating stitches and we are going to work around these 3 front floating stitches. So we'll yarn over twice to do a treble, and we will front float 3 treble. So there's our first one, and here goes our second. The reason why we're front floating this is because as we are placing across, it kind of we don't want it to pucker on the fabric behind. Oop, that was a double. So we want to do a treble so that it gives it enough space to not pull that background fabric as we're crossing. So there's those 3, and now I will single crochet 2 of the background stitches. And now we will go back and front float around those stitches we skipped, and this will create this left cross. And feel free to move your fabric however you like. A lot of times I do crosses. I'll shift my fabric a little bit just to make it comfortable. All right, there's our left cross. Now what I kind of like to do here is push it a little bit so that it's actually crossing and you can see those background stitches in between. Then next we are going to single crochet 5. And now we are going to front float 3 double crochet. And now we're going to single crochet 3 of those background stitches. Front float 3 double crochet. Now this yarn is a bit stiff. I find that these cables work best in a drapey yarn, a softer yarn. We're going to single crochet in the back for our last stitch. And then on the wrong side, of course, you'll single crochet, skipping all these floating stitches. And when you do, make sure that if you need to kind of pull this open to get those background stitches in between, to make sure that we maintain 16 background single crochet stitches. Now I want to come back to, because from here, from row 11 to row 23, until we get to row 23, it's a lot of repeating the same things. You will have these cables that will travel and cross again, but the cross is the exact same left cross that we did here. So when we come back, it's going to be on row 23. Here we are at row 23. I'm so glad you're still with me. As you can see, I have switched yarn because I already had the swatch almost to this point, so it's saving me a little bit of time here. This is also a merino yarn, so as you can see, I do like the look of this in the softer yarns. It seems to lay a little bit better. As I begin, I will single crochet in the first single crochet stitch. The edges, as you've noticed, have remained the same, so at this point, they're starting to feel a little bit, I won't say mundane, I will say comfortable. You've got those down. And then I will single crochet, looking at my chart here, so sorry, I don't want to tell you the wrong number. Then I will single crochet 6. Now this is the next part where you will see that we are switching from double crochet to treble crochet, and this is why. When we are working aggressively, I guess you could say, or quickly, traveling quickly horizontally, because the cool thing with infinity cables is we can travel horizontally quickly because we don't have to worry about gaps and holes. The only thing that we have to worry about is tension of the cable, and so we don't want to have the cable be so tight that it puckers the fabric underneath. So this is where we will do front float 3 treble. And that way, as it lays onto the fabric, it will lay appropriately and travel quickly horizontally. And then we will single crochet 3. And if you'll notice, as you start to place those single crochets, what we just did looks fantastic. It really arches that that line to the left quite seamlessly. Now for the closing curve, the other important part to infinity crochet. And if you're doing any of the vine patterns, you will find that you're going to get really, really good at this, which is why it's almost a great practice for infinity crochet. You will be doing a lot of opening curves and closing curves, and sometimes they take a little bit of practice to get them to look just right. So to do the closing curve, we are going to skip the first 3 floating stitches, and we are going to work in the 4th one over here. We're looking at these, because we're joining them, we're looking at these numbered as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, our next 6 floating stitches. So we will yarn over and go into the 4th floating stitch as if to double crochet, and we will pull through a loop, but we are going to yarn over and pull through again, but we are going to stop with 2 loops on the hook. We are not going to complete that yet. Now we are going to yarn over it again, and we are going to go to the 3rd floating stitch in the sequence, and we are going to double crochet, but once again we are going to stop just short. We are going to stop with 2 loops on the hook. Now what this has done with these is it has joined these 2 stitches to look as if they are joined pretty flawlessly. Now our next 2 stitches that we are going to join are those inner ones on each side. So we are going to work the 5th floating stitch. We're going to do a double crochet, but once again we are going to stop with 2 loops on the hook. Now we're going to work the 2nd floating stitch in the sequence and reach back over and get it, and then we are going to double crochet, leaving 2 loops on the hook, and that has joined those 2. And now for the last, the 6th floating stitch, and now the 1st floating stitch. So we've kind of taken a unique way to kind of twist and join those together. I hope you can see it's looking quite fantastic. Now we have 2 loops on the hook to end with, and we're going to do a little bit of a mock single crochet. This is going to count as a single crochet, but it's the best way I found to kind of tuck and hide this top part on the background fabric is to go through, insert your hook into the very next single crochet, yarn over and pull up a loop. Now you have 3 loops on your hook. You're simply going to yarn over again and pull through all the loops on the hook. It is hiding that a little bit. So you can still see it's a single crochet, kind of hiding those extra loops behind, and that counts as a single crochet stitch, but these no longer count as floating stitches because we've in essence dropped them. That's why you will see the floating stitch count on this row change. These are dropped. They're no longer active, they're closed. So we will only have on this round the first 3, these 3, and these 3. So 9 floating active stitches. Now we're going to single crochet 4, front float, 3 double crochet, and single crochet into our last. Now when we turn and we do the background stitches, that kind of mock slip stitch that we kind of hid some loops into, that counts as a stitch. So you're going to want to work it. You're going to want to work those single crochets across that closed stitch and make sure that the end count is still 16. So there's our first one. I will skip 3 floating stitches, single crochet, and then this stitch right here is kind of that little bit funny one, but honestly it really does look like a single crochet stitch. We're going to work that one, and we're going to work all the way until we hit our next floating stitch, and we're going to skip those 3 floating stitches and continue to work those across. As you can see, that closing curve looks pretty awesome. Sometimes it might take 1 or 2 practices, and it's kind of good to kind of tug it a little bit to get it to sit in there nicely. And you'll continue to work. It's really just a repetitive work of what we just did. There's nothing else in there. And then you will, once again, as this works up, you'll start that opening curve again. So this is what that traveling vine cable looks like, and it's just a repeat of that over and over again to a beautiful cable pattern. Thank you so much for joining me for this project, and I cannot wait to bring you more.